Welcome to another episode of Earth Warrior, the Wednesday series where I try to keep you appraised of the nuclear arms race that's now restarted, which I think is our priority public interest issue for the rest of my lifetime. What's happened most recently is February 15th, which would be 2 days ago at the time of this recording. Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona took a big step by writing an opinion piece in the Washington Post titled "New Start Wasn't a Silver Bullet, but it helped keep the world safe." He said, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, once warned that nuclear rivalry was like two scorpions in a bottle, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. End of quote. Today, the best metaphor is darker and more literal, a house of dynamite. The phrase, recently popularized by the Netflix movie, captures the risky reality in which we're now operating. On February 5th, the treaty known as New START lapsed, eliminating the last legally binding limits on the world's two largest nuclear arsenals, the United States and Russia. This comes as China continues a massive buildup of their arsenal, and North Korea pursues more effective ballistic missiles to carry their nuclear warheads farther. The House of Dynamite is getting larger and less stable, and the last guardrails are now gone. If we want our children and grandchildren to inherit a planet with less risk of nuclear conflict than we had, then that must change. There is one camp of experts who will tell you that arms control is dead, a relic of the past. For those people, the solution is easy. Build more, better bombs and delivery systems that are harder to stop so that our enemies know any nuclear threat will be met with unacceptable costs. That approach does reinforce deterrence, which, by the way, is not by itself an ethical reason to possess nuclear weapons. But the U.S. already possesses that ability with the current arsenal. It also costs billions of dollars to maintain and modernize an even larger and more complex program. Not to mention, doing so would increase the risk that one false move could unleash nuclear weapons capable of destroying the world many times over. A second camp advocates nuclear restraint and arms control, aiming to reduce the likelihood of nuclear conflict by limiting the number of weapons themselves. However, in a world where multiple countries see nuclear buildup as an existential to their security, getting all of them moving in lockstep toward arms control is a massive challenge. And then there's the third camp, led by President Donald Trump, who thinks he can throw hundreds of billions of dollars at a missile defense system he calls the Golden Dome and insulate the country from all risk of nuclear weapons. But there's no guarantee this would work. When it comes to nuclear weapons, the physics favors the offense, who can continue developing their delivery systems, use more complex decoys, and only need a small percentage of their warheads to get through to cause unthinkable destruction. Even just attempting to build an impermeable shield would likely spur adversaries to expand their arsenals to overcome it, leading to an even more dangerous reality. This entire debate is often framed as a choice between deterrence and arms control, but what we've seen in real world suggests stability and preventing disaster depends on both. A strong, flexible, and credible nuclear deterrent combined with thoughtful arms control are the two pillars that have kept our House of Dynamite from detonating. New START is a great example of this approach. Signed in 2010, New START sets limits on the number of strategic nuclear warheads the U.S. and Russia could deploy, created inspections for both sides, and reduced the risk. The miscalculation between Washington and Moscow. At its core, the treaty offered something rare between two large adversaries: predictability. This predictability did not eliminate risk, but it managed it. When both sides know the size and posture of their adversary's nuclear weapons, it reduces incentives for rapid escalation during crisis that could result in nuclear conflict. New START is not without limitations in today's environment. It was negotiated for a bilateral nuclear relationship that has since evolved. China continues a significant nuclear expansion and resists any arms control talks, but it is not yet operating outside the basic constraints of New START's 1,550 warheads and bomb ceiling. Its deployed arsenal remains far smaller than that of the US and Russia, and the Chinese government maintains their no first use doctrine. Tensions between the US and Russia, especially over Ukraine, led to Russia stopping in-person inspections and data sharing. But this agreement also made it easier to keep these tensions from boiling over into miscalculations over nuclear weapons. That's because Russia stayed within the numerical limits of the treaty, and the prohibition on interference with national technical means still allowed the U.S. to monitor Russian strategic forces independently, mainly through satellites. Without an extension of New START, numerical limits, and no successor agreement, that protection disappears. And the next time tensions flare, it could be harder for each side to understand the other's intentions. The expiration of New START marks a more dangerous era, one where it's even harder to address the strategic challenges that the treaty didn't. In a house of dynamite, you don't make yourself safer by adding more sticks and daring your roommate to start a fire. The U.S. needs both strategic deterrence and a renewed diplomatic effort alongside our allies and partners to avoid another arms race. Every day that passes without that makes America less safe. There were 141 comments to Senator Kelly's article, mainly very supportive. Then the next day, the same morning, I made this comment as Earth Warrior 7. Senator, I'm with you. If you place your proposed construct, waiting for China and possibly the others, inside the waiting shell of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons, in my view, the TPNW is the only option for the United States, especially while seriously pursuing a working Golden Dome with diminishing but prioritized funding, and a working disassembled warhead waste repository to demonstrate earnestness near the Waste Isolation Pilot, WIPP, near Carlsbad, New Mexico. This will require President Trump to be the first nuclear weapon power to sign the TPNW. There would be a Nobel Peace Prize in it for him, and while the Senate long deliberates ratification, sets the U.S. on course to lead the process and establish the norms, which you are already suggesting, which will eventually bind all nuclear-armed states when they sign. The existing treaty, the existing TPNW treaty, signed by 95 nations and ratified by 74, has already established a legally binding framework for non-nuclear states to renounce nuclear weapons. Iran has not signed that treaty yet, but is positively inclined. The way out of this complex conundrum of asymmetrical timing, swarming technology, and relatively limited budget resources is counterintuitive to the more is better thinking. Initiating the TPNW process with a presidential signature offers a systematic way to continuously reduce warheads as advocated in the 1984 U.S. Catholic Bishop's Pastoral Letter on War and Peace. Keep up the good work. Then on February 16th, the next day, I commented on a big editorial that the New York Times editorial board published titled, "Trump Risks Igniting a Nuclear Fire." I wrote, "I'm hoping that other senators of both parties are working with Senator Mark Kelly on a mechanism for restraining the nuclear powers, which in my view should be placed inside the waiting shell of the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. In my view, the TPNW is the only option for the United States broad enough to embrace all deadly possibilities. The only reason President Trump might sign TPNW, setting into motion a long ratification debate, would be some realistic hint that he will deservedly receive the Nobel Peace Prize. If he were to sign it, he should receive the prize. Signing sets the U.S. on course to lead the process and establish the norms which will eventually bind all nuclear-armed states when they sign. The existing treaty, signed by 95 nations and ratified by 74, has already established a legally binding framework for non-nuclear states to renounce nuclear weapons. Iran has not signed, but is positively inclined. The way out of this complex knot that is steadily tightening is not more is better thinking. Initiating the TPNW process with a presidential signature offers a systematic way to continuously reduce warheads globally, as advocated in the 1984 U.S. Catholic Bishop's Pastoral Letter on War and Peace. Keep up the good work. 8 people recommended that set of comments that I made. Then, on February 17th, the New York Times had an article covering the first day of nuclear arms negotiations between the United States and Iran in the Omani embassy in Switzerland. And the title of that article was U.S. and Iran Make Good Progress in Geneva Talks, Foreign Minister Says. That's the Iranian foreign minister. I wrote, Exodus, the book, remains a good film for starting to understand Israel, which trusts no one, not even Kushner and Trump of these United States. Will Israel be impressed if the United States, in a deep battle on their behalf, loses ships to a swarm of hypersonic missiles and/or drones? No. How does Trump bring Netanyahu along toward his apparently still narrow goal of a nuclear agreement? He can't. What does Iran get from Russia in return for its timely, abundant supply of drones? We don't know. How do major wars start? By accident. 3 recommended this, and 1 commented saying, Earth Warrior 7, unfortunately, I think the only way this stops is if we attack and take losses. So, that's our situation today with regard to the new nuclear arms race. Thanks for listening.